Reporters for Vice News travel the world, putting a human face to the world's most important stories.
There's a solid wall of riot police officers.
But now, we introduce you to them.
They're doing CPR on one of the casualties here. We don't know who's going to make it.
This is Field Notes, a show that sits down with our reporters to find out the stories behind their stories and how they got so close to the action.
Feel pretty good about that?
In this episode, we meet the team that took us inside India's devastating COVID outbreak, introducing us to workers at an overwhelmed crematorium and to scammers who saw all that desperation as a chance to make a buck.
Go!
The supply truck has finally shown up and they've got all of 13 cylinders to give to all the people waiting out there. You're COVID positive.
Right, I'm COVID positive and standing here to just make up the cylinder.
Is it safe for you to be out here?
There's another one. Is there any option for me? Just tell me this.
Karishma, Angad, thank you for joining me. We're here under pretty bad circumstances. The outbreak, the second wave in India, horrible. I guess I want to start with you, Karishma, because I've been to India many times. I've reported there, a handful of times. What was it like to be there?
It was honestly a really eerie experience. I flew into Delhi and this is a second home to me. I lived in Delhi for 8 years and I couldn't recognize the place. There was nobody out on the streets. There was barely any traffic. And this is a place that is just bustling all the time, day or night. It doesn't matter, it's just teeming with life. And as soon as I landed at the airport, I could tell it was just dead. The city was dead. And people were hiding in their homes because the terror of this virus was so visceral. It was felt by everyone. Every home had been touched by it.
And Angad, we've worked together plenty of times. We're all of South Asian descent. And this is like a personal story, right? We're seeing a country that we love go under some extraordinarily extreme circumstances, a mass death event. What was it like for you reporting it out, being a producer on this piece, making this piece?
We've been covering this for several months, and over that time, almost everyone in my friend circle, family circle, has known somebody that's been affected by COVID-19. I lost a grandparent to COVID-19 during the time we were putting these stories together. And it's really difficult because you realize that, it feels far away, but as part of the South Asian diaspora, it's affecting all of us. And it really, really hits home in that sense. The tragedy, the scale of the tragedy, it's something that is affecting people of all classes, of all backgrounds. It doesn't matter if, your relatives are well-to-do or not. There just simply isn't the resources. And the kind of outrage that's also sparked in my circles in the South Indian diaspora abroad and folks that I know in the country, it's massive because people really feel that the government has failed them. People really feel that the institutions have failed them, and it hurts because there's a lot of suffering and there's a lot of death, and people are having to cope with that, and there's nothing they can do about it.
And this is especially gutting because early in the pandemic, India was held up in some ways as a success story, given how badly it went to the United States. India was relatively unscathed by that first wave. What was it like reporting there, hearing from people about, hey, was the government asleep at the switch here? How could this happen?
Not only asleep at the wheel, but they actively did things that made it easier for the virus to spread, like wildfire in India.
Tell me about that, yeah.
So before, I flew over there, some of the things that were happening in the country was an election in West Bengal. And even as we were seeing cases rising and people kind of raising the alarms, people in the medical community raising the alarms about this, you had the Prime Minister of the country go to a massive election rally in West Bengal and kind of touting what an amazing job the government had done in containing the virus and kind of boasting about the great crowds that had attended the rally to see him. And it was extraordinary to watch that when you knew what was coming, as a result of these mass gatherings. There were elections in other states where, you had the government insist that school teachers come and help them and work during the elections. And that resulted in a lot of deaths of school teachers because they were forced to go out and despite their apprehensions and fears about getting infected, they had to show up and they became infected and also spread the virus within their families. So you really had this perfect storm, this situation where we could see the disaster coming, and yet people were kind of willfully ignoring all the warning signs. And that's why you had this catastrophic second wave take hold in the country.
Why? Why was there a willful neglect, so to speak, of what was seemingly an obvious conclusion during a crucial period, right? Like, had those elections been conducted differently, or rather the rallies and such, like, could have saved lives. Like, why couldn't the government see the writing on the wall and make some moves to try to contain the second wave?
To me, it felt that there was a big sense of hubris. Prime Minister Modi moved decisively and quickly, and some say prematurely, in the first wave. He shut down the entire country on a moment's notice. And a lot of people gave him credit for preventing what people thought might have been a massive outbreak. And then a lot of other folks were saying that India has a very young demographic overall, and that is this sort of natural shield to the population, that's preventing them from experiencing the worst of corona. And you saw that when the rest of the world was getting second wave after second wave, that the Indian ruling party, the BJP, they announced that they had defeated the virus. They started disassembling the surge capacity that they had set up for the first wave just months before the second wave was going to hit. They were touting that they were going to vaccinate the world. It's this sense of hubris that they had that I think really blindsided them to the fact that the reality is COVID doesn't discriminate, and it's going to come, and it's going to come hard. It almost feels like a willful negligence, and I think that's what a lot of folks are outraged about now.
Yeah, I think what it boils down to is arrogance. The government got arrogant, and the public got arrogant because they had done so well compared to the rest of the world. Initially, they thought that there was this kind of sense of invincibility that, like something special about India, that we haven't been as badly affected and we're not going to be as badly affected as the rest of the world. And what that led to is just people letting their guard down. They really felt like they had defeated. The government told them, in fact, that they had defeated this virus. And so, life can return back to normal. And that really is not how science works. That's not how biology works. That's not how viruses work. And like Angad was saying, there was kind of a willful dismissal of science, of the medical community. Because, as we all know, some of the best doctors and scientists are Indian. Yeah. It's not like we did not have the knowledge and the expertise to understand what was happening and to predict what was happening. So what it came down to is people ignoring the experts and just going with their gut feeling about what they should be doing.
And to redouble on that tragedy, there was time to prepare, right? And that, I think, comes to the fore most visibly with oxygen and the shortage of oxygen around the country. And that's something you guys documented quite powerfully. What was it like when people are trying to get oxygen on the black market?
This second wave hit, we're well over a year into this catastrophe. So you've had a year, you've seen what this can do in other countries, you've seen shortages. New York, I was here when New York really was the global hotspot, and there were shortages here in a rich country, rich city, and we had shortages of hospital beds and ventilators and equipment, And so we should have served as a lesson, and we certainly learnt from those lessons here in New York, but countries like India did not heed the warnings that, were obvious from New York and other parts of the world. There's just something so heartbreaking when you think about people dying simply from a lack of oxygen, from, like it's something that we take for granted, just breathing. And they were suffocating to death outside hospitals, trying to get admission into hospitals on, street corners, in taxis and auto rickshaws as their families were desperately trying to go from place to place, trying to get help for them. It's just too horrific to even think about that you could watch your father, your mother, your sibling, your partner just suffocate to death in front of you. And so it was something that was really confronting and difficult to deal with. But what we saw was individuals really stepping up, and that was the most incredible and uplifting thing that we experienced, was that ordinary people like you and me, like our neighbours, just stepping up and doing whatever they could to help complete strangers locate oxygen.
I was struggling thinking beforehand, like, when you go and report on the worst things that happen in the world and you talk to people about the worst things that happen to them in their lives, it's hard, but there is sometimes a glimmer of hope and humanity that you find, because when people are pushed to the edge, that's when so many good things can come out as well. So yeah, speak to me about that, because it's such a horrible situation, but seeing some humanity must have been at least uplifting to some degree.
Definitely. In one of the reports we did, we really juxtaposed two things. On one hand, there's people profiting off the black market of oxygen and scamming people at that, not just selling oxygen cylinders at an absurdly high rate to people that are desperate in need, but then painting fire extinguishers the wrong color and selling those to scam folks that are in desperate need, will pay whatever. On the other hand, you have communities like the Sikh community who volunteer their places of worship, their gurdwaras, convert them into makeshift hospitals, essentially, where they're giving out oxygen to people that are being turned away from government hospitals. So when the government is failing, it's the minorities, the religious minorities of India that are stepping up, opening their doors and saying, guys, we recognize this is a tragedy that's affecting the entirety of humanity, and if it's not going to be the government that's going to step up to save the people, then we've got to help ourselves. And you see these time after time, these inspiring stories of people, stepping up to help their neighbors, stepping up to help anyone, irrespective of their ethnic, religious, caste background. And what strikes me as a little bit outrageous is that you have Prime Minister Narendra Modi, his Hindu Nationalist Party, and the people that sort of serve under him, trying to actively subvert and suppress the fact that people are in need, people are dying. Mm-hmm. You saw in the state of Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous state, the chief minister and his administration were warning people on Twitter if they were asking for oxygen that the police would file warrants against them. They were actively intimidating journalists and doctors that were speaking up about the shortages that the hospitals were facing. On one hand, this is what the administration is doing. On the other hand, here's what people that are vilified by that same Hindu nationalist movement are doing for the community of India. They're stepping up and providing when the government is failing. Sikh Punjabis are a big part of farmers who've been protesting for over a year on the outskirts of New Delhi. And coronavirus or not, they've been staging these massive protests to demand their rights for a year. And the government, people in the ruling party, the right-wing media of India, they've moved to vilify these folks as anti-national separatists who want to see the country being burned down and destroyed. But when it's time for COVID, it's the Sikh community that steps up when the government is failing and actively trying to suppress the knowledge and the facts that the reality is so bad. They're the ones that are providing oxygen to people when the government hospitals are turning them away. And I think those stories, to folks like me, to folks in my community, especially in the diaspora, we see it as uplifting that our people are working tirelessly to serve the humanity that's being neglected by the government, but it's also entirely frustrating that the government is willfully negligent and doesn't seem to really care.
So let's talk about the politics of it, because I think your stories do such a great job of showing the human crisis and how the people of India are making it through. But I think there's a lot to talk about from a political standpoint. You guys are two very smart reporters that I'm interested to hear your thoughts, because Modi was reelected, right? There were crises prior to his reelection, but it didn't seem like he paid a political cost, or the BJP paid much of a political cost. Given the abject failure of that administration to deal with this second wave, is there a political cost to be borne by the party, by Modi?
This is something I tried to ask pretty much everybody that I met through my reporting, people waiting in oxygen lines, doctors working in hospitals. And I was shocked at how many people say, you can't really blame the government for what's happening. It's people are not taking the COVID virus seriously and not social distancing, not wearing masks. What I think has happened is that Indians en masse have lowered their expectations so much of what a government can and should do for them. And this is something that you can't just blame the Modi administration for. I think for generations, ever since India's independence, really, whether it's a Congress party-led government or a BJP-led government, Indians have been groomed over decades to have low expectations of their government, because every administration has failed to address the very basic concerns that people in this country have. We're talking about education, access to healthcare, infrastructure development, jobs, All of that is something that Indians over time understand that they have to take care of themselves. The government is not going to come and
to push back against that, but because the early stages of the Modi government, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, was built on hey, the government can work. This idea that India can modernize under a strong, active leader, not Congress party. But what I'm hearing from you is that maybe they're just falling back on a previous expectation of what Indian governments can or cannot do.
Well, I think to that point, the Indian government is very central and active when it's in their benefit. And when they realize that this is a truly difficult situation, it's very hands-off, especially this Modi administration. Now, to your point, the Modi administration in its first term has touted its success of electrifying all of India, building toilets for all of rural India. Massive infrastructure achievements for a country that is over 2/3 rural. They have the political bandwidth, they have the grassroots mobilization to reach to every part of rural India, to every part of the country. But what you've seen throughout the pandemic is a very hands-off approach, a very non-existent Modi, a leader that's not willing to come in front of the masses and admit the severity of the pandemic. He finds it more important to tout the size of the crowds at his election rallies than to give people advice that, hey, we should be social distancing, we should be wearing masks. And that is, I think, a failure of administration. It is a willful decision that this is not politically expedient for us. We can't get political gains off this, so it's going to be an issue that we divulge to the state. And we've seen this in their policy. What the Modi administration has done for a long time was when they went for vaccine rollouts, they said it's up to individual states. It's not the center's responsibility to procure vaccines for the states. They've recently walked that back,
right.
But that was the long-standing policy for a long time. Whereas he's been very proud to be the central government's taking the charge on all these other issues. But when it comes to dealing with the COVID crisis, very hands-off.
Surprising a little bit.
It's not just surprising, it's shocking. The government's priorities during one of the worst crises the country has faced in its history is focused more on its PR strategy, about how it's being perceived in the international press. In fact, we have tried advice to get visas for many of our journalists to go in and report on this. And the government is not handing out visas to foreign journalists. It's become very, very difficult. And this is because they are entirely focused on how the Modi administration is perceived, not just within India, but outside India as well. This is why they're targeting anybody, including doctors, who, out of absolute desperation, are tweeting out that SOS, we need oxygen tanks. Our hospital is about to run out of oxygen tanks in 2 hours. Instead of seeing messages like that and mobilizing the infrastructure, the resources the government has to help these hospitals and these patients, they're trying to prosecute these doctors for alerting the public that they're in trouble. So you can just see this incredibly warped sense of priorities in India, where instead of focusing on the extremely urgent needs of the community, of hospitals, of rural communities who are being decimated by this virus, they're more focused on ensuring that they're not criticized for their abject failure.
By that hyper focus on politics, you lose the humanity. We have to remember, why was Modi elected? Why was he so popular across the country? It's because of his humble backgrounds. He's a son of a chaiwala, tea seller. He actively promotes the narrative that he comes from humble beginnings, and if I could do it, any Indian can, that this country is a place where people can succeed, the common man can succeed. That is his political narrative, that is his political strategy, that's what he sold to the people. But when it comes to COVID, he's totally forgotten about the working class. And you saw that in his first wave, when he imposed that lockdown on a day's notice. People were forced to walk home across the country. Transportation was shut down. They had nowhere to go. The migrant worker, thousands died across the country because of this. I mean, Modi seems to have forgotten the fact that he comes from the working class background, that these are the people that elected him because they saw themselves in him. And he's totally abandoned them.
Well, thank you guys for the reporting. Crucial stuff at a really horrible time.
Thanks, Krishna.
Thanks.